Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Fugitive Word Seminar of 2022. We have the honor of hosting Ajay Skaria today, who is a member of the research team and really is one of the people working with us who needs very little introduction. Ajay is professor of history at the University of Minnesota, and anyone who has heard of such a thing as post-colonial studies and subaltern studies won't have missed his work. Ajay has written extensively on tribal and oral history making during colonial times and slightly before, including his momentous Hybrid Histories, which was one of the first proper books I've ever read about India. He has written on modernity and its rhetoric. He has written on democracy and lately on Gandhi. His Unconditional Equality is a fantastic book which everyone should read. Today he'll also talk to us about Gandhi, and today he will speak on revisiting non-willing freedom, how Gandhi matters today. So welcome Ajay, and welcome everyone who is here today.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, Anastasia. Dilip was just saying before everybody came on that he's not heard me speak on anything except Gandhi for a long time. He said forever, but I would qualify that and say for a long time. And it's true, it's nearly 20 years since I started working on Gandhi. And if even a year or two before that, you'd asked me whether I would work on Gandhi, I would have emphatically said no, because in the leftist circles that I was part of, it was kind of taken for granted that Gandhi was, critiques of Gandhi were very, very commonplace, for his sexism, for his casteism, for the way he was seen as having enabled a conservative Hinduism, etc., right? And the scholarship at that time confirmed the feeling, indeed, in terms of characterizing Gandhi's historical impact, the scholarship of those like Guha, Shahid Amin, David Hardiman, and Partha Chatterjee remains indispensable, and I don't think that I would like to fundamentally qualify the arguments that they make about his historical impact. So partially because I broadly agreed with this assessment, I thought the critique of Gandhi as of his religiosity was in the main complete, and that what remained was certainly not intellectually interesting enough to spend many years working on. But increasingly, I have come to sense, and which is why I've possibly been working on it for 20 years now, that while many of these critiques are entirely correct and should even be sharpened, they can, if made too quickly, also obscure from us what is most radical about Gandhi, right? His questioning of a will-centered freedom, and that's what I would like to focus on today. And to my mind, such a questioning remains indispensable for a left and democratic politics today, even if it must necessarily proceed by relinquishing many of Gandhi's specific formulations and arguments. To indicate why this questioning is, how and why this questioning is essential, I would like to start by drawing a contrast between two ways of rendering the famous slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity. Right? As you know, of course, the slogan is associated with the French Revolution. But as you also know, I don't think I need to say this in this circle, it's not particularly useful to think of that slogan or of the ideas associated with that slogan as quintessentially European. Right? So I will not get into that. I just want to get into the point that liberty, equality, fraternity, condensed in the slogan is a question: how to be free and equal as a people. This question, how to be free and equal as a people, is a question that we have been in the grip of ever since the 18th century. It is this question and our various attempts to quilt a just answer to this question that could in some senses be said to describe our political modernity. And I think we can distinguish between two broad ways of answering this question of how to be free and equal as a people. One, a way centered around affirming the will, and second, the way centered around relinquishing the will, or at least a skeptical relationship with it. The dominant answer, the almost ubiquitous answer, has been in terms of the way centered around the affirmation of the will. And the other one, attempting to relinquish the will, has been much more marginal. So much so that we do not even usually recognize it as another path. But it has never quite disappeared from view. And from its concealment, it is even very important. And in our current times, thematizing it may be more important than ever. Now, Gandhi is one of the few political actors, the very few political actors, to be committed to acting in a way that relinquishes or constantly steps back from the will. You can almost count on your fingers the prominent ones in active politics who were committed and in various ways to the way of non-willing. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King. Of course, there are many other lesser known figures, but I'll not go into that right now. And again, when you turn to political philosophers, those who think of a politics outside the will are very, very few. Most of all, Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt, enormously different though the two are from each other. Indeed, Arendt explicitly contrasts two ways of being free. She reserves the term liberty for the will-centered way and the term freedom for the other way. Also, I think what I should stress is that few of these political actors or philosophers explicitly lay out a liberty, equality, and fraternity centered around relinquishing the will. Not even Arendt. This is not surprising because it is perhaps always the fate of those who think really new thoughts to not be able to entirely discern the newness of what they do, to struggle to put it in words or to articulate it in contradictory terms. It is only we latecomers who might be able to see patterns that were not discernible to these actors and philosophers themselves. This contrast between two politics, one centered around the will and the other centered around relinquishing the will, is the often obscured heart of Gandhi's politics. This is why he contrasts two visions of Swaraj, one that he calls parliamentary Swaraj and the other that he calls true Swaraj. And what he calls parliamentary Swaraj is what I'm here calling the way centered around affirming the will. And what he calls true Swaraj is what I'm here describing as the way centered around relinquishing the will. So in order to tease out how Gandhi matters today, I would like to briefly address 4 questions. First, what is the politics that affirms the will of the people? Second, what is distinctive about parliamentary Swaraj or Republican democracy as a form of will-centered politics? Third, what would be involved in a politics that relinquishes the will? Fourth, what is the relationship between these two politics, between the politics that affirms the will and the one that relinquishes the will? So those are the 4 questions I'll take up. And let me begin with the first, how to describe a politics that affirms the will of the people, which requires asking first, of course, what is the will? Simplifying massively, you can see that exercising a will involves 3 intertwined aspects. One, it involves acting to realize what I wish to do. If I have a wish, but I do not act on the wish, then I cannot be said to be exercising my will. I would be merely indulging my daydreams. 2, to exercise the will involves mastering a situation. The object on which I exercise mastery may be natural forces, say when I undertake to build something. It may be non-human animals, say the process of domestication, or it may be other humans, say a factory. But in every case, exercising the will involves mastery over. Third, even if I simply exercise mastery over something, I'm not necessarily exercising my will. I'm exercising a will only if my wishes are not simply desires that have overcome me. If I've been overcome by my desires, then I am a slave to them. Then I cannot be said to be exercising my will. In that sense, there is also a mastery over the self involved in the will. These, you can say, are the 3 most rudimentary features of the will. Right? So far, I've talked of the will as though we were talking of individuals. But we are not talking here of individuals. We are talking of society. And when we talk of society, we have to add another concept to the mix, authority. The concept of authority, which I take from Arendt, I should mention, describes a symbolic and generative locus of the political, the principle that governs a society because it is widely accepted. If you're exercising authority over me, you are not willing me to do something. What is distinctive about authority is that you and I both accept the legitimacy of the order where you command and I follow your command. It is from this order, which is distinct from you and me, that authority draws its force, not from your exercising your will over me. An almost textbook example of authority could be the way we often characterize a pre-modern caste system and the way it functioned most of the time, though never all the time. Both in the pre-modern world and today, a tyrant would be one who exercises will or mastery without authority, who may not even claim authority. Now, the reason I'm stressing this word authority is partially because authority as a concept does different will work from hegemony or interpellation. The latter is within the problematic of the will. To say that a force is hegemonic is to dispute the idea that people are acting under their own will. It is to suggest that will is to be located not in persons or individuals, but in certain ideologies, in materialized ideas. And that some of these materialized ideas have become commonsensical enough to appear as actors as the manifestation of their own will. As for interpellation, as my late friend Qadri Ismail said in response to an email, it is the subjection of agency or the imposition and transformation of thus, for instance, a Mexican from a country without Hispanics becomes Hispanic upon arriving in the US. So there's a kind of transformation of subjectivity that takes place with it. In contrast to these two phenomena, authority names the moment when we freely, though not necessarily intentionally, split ourselves, except that we are not acting of our own will, and when we conceive the other under whose aegis we act, not in terms of a will, but in terms of what is proper. Right? So I think that acceptance of not acting under one's own will is crucial to the concept of authority. Yep. With modernity, one of the striking things that happens is that the locus of authority shifts to the people. With this, when sovereigns exercise their will, they claim their authority from the people. Again, I would stress that this is not only some European phenomenon that spreads outwards. For example, quite independent of any European influence, you have the rhetoric in India of Maratha Swaraj or Jat communities claiming rule. These are obviously not people in a modern sense, but the idea that the sovereign claims authority not from some order that stands independent of both the ruler and the ruled, not from some assent from or consonance with the ruled, but rather as a representative of the ruled. In this idea, we already have the receptivity to what will later be the modern concept of the people. And of course, in the centuries since then, this tendency to claim authority or sanction from the people has only increased. Even the most brutally repressive regimes of the 20th and 21st century have claimed to rule in the name of the people. So you can see what I mean when I say that a politics that claims authority from the people, that claims that it only represents their will, has become dominant with modernity. Indeed, every nationalist movement that seeks to establish itself in the state is nothing but an assertion that it is the will of the people, and so should prevail. When Tilak says, for example, that Swaraj is his birthright, what he means is that the will of the Indian people should determine the forms of rule in India. His understanding of the people is, of course, notoriously upper caste, but that is irrelevant for my purposes here. What I would stress is something broader, that this emphasis on the will of the people is something that is shared across the political spectrum. If you think of the Marxist tradition, for example, including Marx himself most of the time, running through it is the argument that liberal democracies only obfuscate the will of the people, obscure it even from the people themselves, and that what is needed is the realization instead of a socialist will. This is the sense in which I'm saying that the will of the people is a hegemonic imaginary across the political spectrum. Will-centered politics has hegemonized our imaginations, so much so that there is no easy exit from it. Indeed, the very possibility of an exit boggles imagination, which is why the few thinkers and political actors who have attempted an exit have often gone down so many dead alleys and tied themselves up in knots. So that's the first question that I just want to take up, the question of what is a will-centered politics. I want now to turn to the second question, which is what is distinctive about what Gandhi calls parliamentary swaraj as a way of articulating the will of the people, right? You know, as you can see, as we all know, you know, the will of the people is a collective thing, and it's a hypostatized entity, you know, and that this hypostatized entity includes all the residents of a land and people is not at all necessary, as we know all too well, right? And the will of the people has usually worked in profoundly exclusionary ways. It is in this context that the languages of liberal democracy and republican democracy are important. The two are not the same, though they're often practically indiscernible from each other, and each bears the potentiality of the other. And the term parliamentary swaraj connotes both. Liberal democracy is the coming together of two forms of the will. On the one side, democracy with its emphasis on the will of the people, and on the other side, liberalism with its emphasis on the primacy of the will of individuals, embodied in rights. Hence, it is that liberalism need not be democratic. For example, in a constitutional monarchy, the democracy need not be liberal, for example, in a populist order. And indeed, that liberal orders can be founded on apartheid, right? Historically, South Africa, Israel today, it can be founded on colonialism or imperialism and racism. So let me just say, without going too much into liberal democracy, because that's something that we are kind of more familiar with, that in liberalism, the will of the people is recognized not as one, but as many, as incapable of being made into one, as having many domains of action. For example, as important as the distinction between negative and positive rights is, maybe even more important is the distinction between public and private rights. So liberal democracy is one aspect of parliamentary swaraj, how the will of the people is recognized as plural, and how this plurality of wills is protected, at least in principle, against domination by any one fraction of the will that claims to speak for the whole. To describe this division and pluralization of the will, Claude Lefort has a very nice phrase, the empty place of power. Right. To draw on his terms, what is distinctive about liberal democracy is that it rests on the premise that power belongs to no one, that those who exercise power do not possess it, that they do not indeed embody it, and the exercise of power requires a periodic and repeated contest, and that the authority of those vested with power is created and recreated as a result of the manifestation of the will of the people. Unquote. Perhaps we could push Lefort's argument in a slightly different direction and stress also the other aspect of what Gandhi calls parliamentary swaraj, which is republican democracy, which involves perhaps more importantly the separation of will from authority, the necessity for the will to be complemented and supplemented by authority. The most visible way in which republican democracy manifests its difference is in the division of powers into different branches of the government. What we often do not heed enough, however, is that this division is also a division between authority and the will. Right? Rather than the executive branch simply claiming authority from the periodic mandates of the elections, republican democracy institutionalizes will in the executive and authority in the legislative, and even more in the judiciary and law. This institutionalized division of will from authority is what makes democracy republican. To anchor democracy in authority is not only to sanction and sanctify the will, it is also to significantly modulate the will, even on occasion to suspend it. To be bound by the law, thus, is not only to will within the bounds of the law, it could also involve acting in the spirit of the law rather than in the spirit of the executive will, right? But Republican democracy is not only a form of government, even if that is what it most evidently appears to be. It is also a personal and social comportment, a manner of conducting ourselves in accordance with authority. Here, however, authority is transformed. It is not so much hierarchical as democratic. What would democratic authority mean? It would mean that I accord you respect, or even maybe submit to you, not because we both accept an order which decrees your superiority, but because I, and maybe you, accept an order which decrees your moral equality. This moral equality involves being free in a way very different from liberal democracies. In the spirit of Hannah Arendt, let us call the first way of being free, that is to say, that involved in Republican democracy, as freedom, and the second, liberty. Liberty is obviously centered around the will in its Lockean formulations about an equality that springs from self-ownership. But even if less obviously, the will springs also in Kantian formulations about an equality that springs from the categorical. The will prevails also in Kantian formulations about an equality that springs from the categorical imperative. For the categorical imperative too begins with the individual will and only subsequently goes on to impose limits on that will when it meets another will-bearing being, or in the modern reformulations of Kant that seek to make space for non-human animals, another animate being. By contrast, the moral equality involved in Republican democracies springs from a theme that is very much present, but also recessive in Kant, conscience, which is also one of Gandhi's translations of the word antaratma, inner voice. Unlike will, conscience begins from the relationality with oneself, which precedes the will, and which is itself generated by a relationality with the world. And Republican democracy is that activation of conscience where I recognize my relationship with you as a moral equal. And so according to the political equality, the power to participate equally in quilting the political, that necessarily follows from this. Now, I need not tell you, especially not this group, that this thumbnail sketch that I've provided is not how Republican democracy has worked at any place, anywhere, right? Certainly not in either the United States or India, the two places that I call home. But my point here is not to function, for now at least, on the actual functioning of Republican democracies, but on their aspirational focus. It is this aspirational focus that makes Gandhi demand parliamentary swaraj. It is this aspirational focus that is at the heart of the Indian Constitution. Because this aspirational focus seems so desirable, especially at a time like this, when it is grievously threatened by authoritarian populism, we may well be tempted to ask, why do we need to question Republican democracy? Is not really the problem that we have not realized Republican democracy. Here, I think it helps to recall a wry remark that Arendt makes, that there is something paradoxical about a freedom based on a faculty whose essential activity consists in dictate and command. Born in self-mastery, the will works through a mastery of the means needed to achieve its ends. Will also strengthens a particular concept of reason and knowledge, not the substantial reason anguished by ethical questions about right and wrong means and ends, but the instrumental reason that simply determines the most effective means to an end. In other words, while a Republican democracy, that is to say, a democracy centered on the one hand around the will-centered practice of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and around, on the other hand, around the separation of will from authority, while a Republican democracy is certainly preferable to tyrannies where the will rides roughshod over individual wills, while it is certainly preferable to the fusion of will involved in authoritarian populism, it is nevertheless profoundly violent in ways that we know well, especially today in India, right? So on to the third question then. What would be involved in a politics that relinquishes the will? This is the politics that Gandhi describes as true swaraj. And as he writes about it, he's drawn to the word religion. He can think true swaraj only in terms of religion, nor is he alone in this. The most intense thinkers of this politics that relinquishes the will have also been drawn to the term religion at the moment that they've thought about that they've engaged with the question of relinquishing the will. Think, for example, of both Ambedkar and Martin Luther King. So the question is, what is the work, what is the conceptual work that religion does? Why is religion so important here? Here we may take an initial cue from what Gandhi says in Anasakti Yoga, that the Gandhi is not a historical work. The Gita is not a historical work. By this, he means, as he puts it just a little while later, that while the people therein describe may be historical, the author of the Mahabharata has used them merely to drive home his religious theme. The contrast here between religion and history is also implicitly a contrast of two different kinds of time. In the sense that he's using it here, a historical work is something that places something in an empirical and calendrical time, or tells a story that unfolds in such a time. For professional historians, and perhaps for Gandhi too, this empirical time would not include the gods and goddesses. Still, it cannot be denied both in Gandhi's times and ours, people have found gods and goddesses in this empirical time. For example, when people make the claim that Ram was born in Ayodhya and therefore that the temple be built there. For many believers, this kind of time, sometimes called mythical time, or the time in which gods rub shoulders and with humans and perform miracles, is part of religion. It is, of course, different from historical time, but like historical time, it is marked by empiricality. As professional historians, we are often troubled by this because we anchor our truths in empirical time and would not like to share this empirical time with the modality of myth. Now, when Gandhi says Gita is religious, he means that it exists outside this religious time, whether historical or mythical. There are many ways of being outside empirical time. Perhaps Gandhi is aware of this, which may be why he insists in Anasakti Yoga that the Gita is not an aphoristic work. It is a great religious poem. So we can ask the question again, what is this religious time that Gandhi is contrasting to both empirical and aphoristic time? And to get at the answer, we could take a detour through a remark by Claude Lefort again, and I should quote him now. What philosophy discovers in religion is a mode of portraying or dramatizing the relations that human beings establish with something that goes beyond empirical time and the space within which they establish relations with one another. Or a little while later, every religion states in its own way that human society can only open onto itself by being held in an opening it did not create. Philosophy says the same thing, but religion said it first, albeit in terms that philosophy cannot accept. To my mind, this is a rigorous first approximation, both of religion as a concept and of the affinity between philosophy and religion. It brings us to the sense in which Gandhi or King or Ambedkar or many others who are concerned with social justice find religion an unavoidable horizon. It avoids also all those sloppy formulations which make a religion secularism contrast by treating religion as transcendent and secularism as immanent. It sidesteps too those accurate but still misleading formulations such as those by Assad, which suggest that late 19th century anthropological and theological thought rendered a variety of overlapping social usages rooted in changing and heterogeneous forms of life into a single immutable essence and claimed it to be the object of a universal human experience called religion. Yes, of course, the concept of religion became modern when it is counterpointed to the secular and identified itself as a secular domain. But in its modern remaking as a domain analogous, in other words, to the domains of culture, the state, economics, and so forth, this modern remaking should not obscure from us the sense that the word religion, like analogous terms such as dharma, has arguably always carried. The insinuation of the experience of being held in another time, a time outside the empirical, which is nevertheless constitutive of our sociality. The experience of being held in an opening and time we do not create. Right? But to recognize that philosophy and religion share something that sets them apart from the empiricality that marks history and myth, apart from the non-empiricality of aphorism, is to arrive at another question: what distinguishes religion from philosophy? And of course, we can all rattle off in our sleep the commonsensical answer that philosophy gives to this question, that it opens itself to society through reason, while religion opens itself to society through faith. Like all commonsensical answers, or answers given in the sleep that mistakes itself for wakefulness, this one intimates something important in an obscured way. It is not so much through faith that religion opens society onto itself as through sacred. Of course, as through the sacred. Of course, it is no longer easy, at least in disciplinary circles, to associate religion with the sacred. Anthropologists and sociologists and historians have often gone looking for the sacred and have found that they have to hedge its operation with so many caveats that they've become increasingly skeptical of it. The sacred, they have declared, is too crude a criterion of the religious. That they've arrived at this finding is not surprising, for the sacred does not easily lend itself to being winkled out by the methodologies of empirical time that suffuse these disciplines. The best way to get a sense of the sacred is by turning to the word sacrifice. Sacrifice is not simply etymologically associated with the sacred. It is through sacrifice that the sacred is performed, brought into being. Indeed, there is no religion without sacrifice and the sacred. And what I want to draw attention to here in the context of the will is that sacrifice is not willed action. Indeed, the moment we confront the sacred, we are no longer in the realm of the will. We have surrendered our will. We act without the will. And yet we act freely. Our relationship with the sacred is a free one. Something is sacred, after all, only if we freely make it so. So now we can get a glimpse of why religion is so important to Gandhi and all the other thinkers of a freedom outside the will. It is in the action involved in religion that we arrive at the threshold of a relinquishment of the will. To understand religion in terms of the sacred is also to recalibrate the usual distinctions between religion and secularism, or for that matter, between religion and philosophy. For if we understand the sacred properly as that which calls forth sacrifice, then secularism and philosophy too have their sacralities. The primacy of the immanent for non-democratic secularisms, some version of the rights of man and citizen for democratic secularisms, and the primacy of reason for disciplinary philosophy at least. The religiosity courses too, even through those of us, such as I, and I expect most of you in this group, who are dispositionally atheist. We too, after all, sacralize, maybe especially some dear persons, maybe some principles. And to have a religious disposition as a person or a group, this too must be understood differently. It means making our sacralities not only the meaning that embellishes our lives, but also the food that sustains it. I have talked so far in very broad brushstrokes about Gandhi's religion. But if you had to get to what is distinctive about it, I've talked broad brushstrokes of sacrifice and religion, but if you had to get to what is distinctive about Gandhi's religion, we have to distinguish between two kinds of religiosity, which may as a shorthand be called theological and mystical. Both insist that societies open onto themselves by being held into an opening that they did not create, the secret, but they do so in entirely incommensurable ways. And to get at this incommensurability, it helps to revisit that old distinction between belief and faith, which again, is something that Arendt very briefly revisits in What is Authority. Belief is what we arrive at through knowledge, whether that knowledge is presumed to be objective, as in science, or subjective, as in the convictions that I can defend, or a divinity or God whose existence I can prove, at least to my satisfaction. Central to belief, I would stress, is sovereignty. The sovereignty of the institutions of science or religion, the sovereignty of theology, the sovereignty of the divine. We use the adjective theologico-political to describe the modern nation state precisely because it has taken over the sovereignty that had been provided by the divine. Strictly speaking, we should describe it as onto-theologico-political, since the state strives to be not just the highest value, but also the grounding value. Theological religion calls for a profoundly and decidedly violent form of sacrifice. Sometimes it demands of its devotees the sacrifice of others, of those who have been deemed the enemy. Only through such a sacrifice murder can the devotees of theological religion prove their fidelity to God, to their God. Sometimes it demands even more of its devotees, their own lives. What makes theological religion in all its forms, including that of the modern nation state, what marks the theological religion in all its forms, including that of the modern nation state, is that it demands a surrender that is also a subordination. Devotees must not only surrender to, but also subordinate themselves to the divine. And here, even if devotees surrender their will, the sovereign does not. Indeed, the will persists, but now as a prerogative primarily of the sovereign. And to the extent that devotees sublate themselves into or realize themselves in the sovereign, they too partake in the sovereign will. As such, theological religion is not at all a politics of non-willing. Rather, it is more a subordination of individual wills to a higher will, a will that moreover fuses authority in it. If Gandhi and Ambedkar were so willing to embrace secular democracy, especially in its institutionalized form as Republican democracy, despite their deep reservations about it, this was in no small part because they felt it would provide at least some respite from the theological religion that the secular nation state can easily become. This was because Republican democracy provides for a separation of will and authority. As things have turned out, that respite has been too short. Both in India and elsewhere, Republican democracy is increasingly being done by authoritarian populism. Conceptually, authoritarian populism can be described as involving a double fusion. On the one hand, it vehemently denies and represses any differences within the people, the ultimate source of authority for modern states, insists that the people has a true form and claims to represent the people in its unicity. On the other hand, it repudiates the separation of will and authority and fuses the two together, insisting that the will of the people is always already also their authority. So that's one aspect, what I call theological religion. Now, mystical religion is a different matter altogether. Though mystical is, strictly speaking, too positive a term, perhaps the phenomenon is described better negatively as a withdrawal from theology, as a negative theology of sorts. The mystical involves a moment of faith, a moment where a certain finitude and vulnerability is accepted not as a momentary risk before subsumption into the sovereign, but as a fact of life. Here, there is a surrender of the will, and this surrender is not a subordination to a higher will. It is rather a persistence in surrender that refuses to accept determination by any will. This is why it can be called a surrender without subordination. Surrender without subordination, I would stress, also involves an altogether different kind of sacrifice. To begin with, here sacrifice can only be self-sacrifice. To sacrifice the other, this would be to already act in a theological manner. If Gandhi is so fascinated by the Gita, this is because he reads it arguably in an idiosyncratic manner, but that is not my concern here. This is because he reads it as providing the protocols for such a mystical sacrifice. He opposes his reading of the Gita, especially to theological readings such as those that put forth by Tilak, which suggested that even violent action was justified as long as it was not driven by a selfish desire for fruits. In other words, for Tilak, violence was justified if the fruit was reaped by the theological figure of the nation state. By contrast, what Gandhi stresses is swach sadhan, or pure means, not renunciation of fruit to a higher sovereign, but abandonment of the very logic of thinking in terms of fruit or end. To reject fruit or end in this way is to be left with sacrifice as simply pure means, or swach sadhan. To offer action as pure means is to try and make sacrifice into a pure gift, something given and received uneconomically. This emphasis on pure means is also what justifies Gandhi's politics of ahimsa or satyagraha. For a politics of faith, the end, which is another way of conceptualizing the sovereign, is constitutively unknowable. Faced with this constitutive unknowability, satyagrahis can only practice the pure means of satyagraha, which after 1915, pure means and satyagraha increasingly become interchangeable words for Gandhi. Amongst the striking moves that marks Gandhi's politics then is the way that pure means is not a philosophical abstraction, but part of the everyday life, not just of satyagrahis, but aspirationally of ordinary people. Yeah. Already in his Swaraj, there is the implication that satyagraha is practiced in families, sometimes if not always, and that what the editor is suggesting is that this practice be carried over to a wider field. How is pure means practiced in such intimate relations? It is arguably in friendship that we can discern the protocols of pure means. What sets friendship apart from all other intimate relationships, after all, is that friends are equals. More than any other loving relationship, one is free with friends, even when one is commanding them. Not by being in a willed relationship with them, not by insisting on one's rights in relation to them, but by the enactment of a certain surrender. And there is no purpose or instrumentality in friendship. We enjoy friends for themselves. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. Obviously, she wants to go out. Yeah. So one way of describing, moreover, we enjoy friends for themselves, as I was saying. Moreover, while the surrender leaves us vulnerable to friends and loved ones, here vulnerability is also a distinctive power over our friends. Distinctive because it is exercised through an authority that has nothing to do with the will. One way of describing satyagraha is that it transposes the spirit of friendship to non-intimate relationship. As such, it could be described as political friendship or democratic neighborliness, friendship with neighbors, especially the marginalized or the strange amongst them, and the strange amongst them. In fact, originally I thought of presenting here an essay called "Who is Gandhi's Neighbor," which I'm almost done with. The only reason I didn't do it was that it was nearly 30 pages long, and I couldn't see any way to condense the argument into a 40-minute presentation. So in Gandhi's writings and politics, this kind of neighborliness rather displaces the universal human. This is why in his Swaraj, the editor insists that the impulse to serve every individual in the universe this is why it attacks in the impulse to serve every individual in the universe and insists on the primacy of immediate neighbors, quote unquote immediate neighbors, a phrase that incidentally does not occur in the Gujarati, which just says aspas vasta loko, which is those living nearby. This is why he defines Swadeshi as a spirit in us which restricts us to the use and services of our immediate to the exclusion of the more remote. Democratic neighborliness is itself a discipline, and its rigorous practice has a distinctive fruit. An authority that, like the authority involved in intimate friendship, has nothing to do with the will. It is this authority that Gandhi sought to exercise, rightly or wrongly, in his fasts and marches, the fast against mill workers, in Ahmedabad, the fast against separate electorates, the Salt March, the Noakhali marches, and so on. One should add, as the memory of the fast against separate electorates should suffice to remind us, surrender without subordination or pure means does not by itself lead to a correct decision. This is so in two senses. One is that of misrecognition, right? Imperfect discipline can lead practitioners not recognize that what they think of as surrender without subordination is actually nothing of that sort. Then also in every situation, surrender without subordination can itself lead to divergent decisions. Gandhi himself discusses the many divergent right responses in the case of Harish Chandra raising his sword on Taramati. As Gandhi notes, he could raise his sword in the first instance because he loved her so greatly as to make the refusal to do so an act of self-interest, as to make the act itself one of self-sacrifice. Gandhi notes that Harish Chandra would have preferred to sacrifice himself if this had been possible. But, and he goes on, I quote, if no self-interest had been involved and she had not been his queen, if Harish Chandra had been repelled by the deed himself, then his hand would have refused to obey him and he could have resorted to satyagraha. In other words, whichever way Harish Chandra acted, he would have been resorting to satyagraha in the broader sense of action as pure means or surrender without subordination. So surrender without subordination, I'm trying to emphasize, does not describe the correct decision. This is as it should be, right? Save in the most simple cases, if such exists, no morality can tell us what our decision should be in a singular situation. Every morality can tell us only the broad contours of how to make a decision, leaving open an entire sheaf of actions quite compatible with these contours. Thus, Gandhi made innumerable decisions that we should vehemently disagree with. Most of all, in retrospect, it is evident that in the exercise of the considerable authority that his discipline had garnered for him, he was insufficiently sensitive to whether it would be experienced by those at its receiving end as dominating them. He was insensitive also to how his authority converged with dominant values, thus strengthening hegemony rather than its opposite, which pure means exemplifies, that is to say, authority without will. Nor can one say that surrender without subordination is flatly non-violent. Surrender without subordination is always only enacted aspirationally. As such, it is non-violent only in this sense that it strives for finitude rather than the infinitude and mastery involved in the will. But is finitude always the most non-violent form? What is the violence inherent in the practice of finitude? What I've tried to suggest elsewhere is that while a will-centered politics is certainly more likely to destroy the world, say climate change, turn genocidal, or intensify structural violence, a politics of relinquishing the will is not some already given template to be applied to existing situations. It poses its own challenges and makes its own distinctive demands on thought. And I should have added action. Now we can turn to the last question. What is the relation between a will-centered politics and politics that relinquishes the will? As a first pass, we could revisit will-centered politics by contrasting pure means or surrender without subordination with the finest moment in a will-centered politics, the Kantian categorical imperative. In its classical incarnation, that imperative calls on us to treat all rational beings, that is to say, for practical purposes, humans, our own selves included, as never merely a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Some quite persuasive reformulations have suggested that it can be extended without contradiction even to non-rational beings, to treating all animate life as ends. But these reformulations do not affect the abyssal difference between Kantian and Gandhian perspectives. The abyssal difference is this: the categorical imperative theologizes, while surrender without subordination withdraws from theology. The categorical imperative is the democratization of will-centered politics. It works by putting limits on how the will is to be exercised by those who are ends in themselves. To treat humanity or animate life as an end is to sacralize it. The powerfully democratic impulse of the categorical imperative lies in the way that it brings the sacred to earth, pluralizes it, including all humans and maybe all by imbuing all humans and maybe all animate life with sacrality, and so barring violence against it. And this powerfully democratic impulse can certainly be strengthened, should be strengthened, by proceeding down the vistas opened by the categorical imperative, by layering and leavening that imperative, by insisting on the centrality of recognition, by insisting on egalitarianism, on the rights of the most oppressed and the exploited, and on separating will from authority. It is the treacherous but necessary path down these vistas that I've been describing as Republican democracy. But even as Republican democracy protects some particular lives against the violence of theology, all this only inscribes that violence deeper, if at a structural and less immediately visible register. For it does not bar either instrumental relations with the world or even the sacrifice of others to humanity, the abstract end that we deem sacred. Abandoning the abstract end, humanity, for the even more abstract and animate life will not end the logic of sacrificing others. The earth and the world can still be sacrificed to the expanded world of ends. The logic of the categorical imperative, in other words, only quickens the conflagration of the world. That conflagration is what has led to the Anthropocene and to the climate change that is now upon us. Contrast this to surrender without subordination, the politics of pure means. That relation withdraws from means and relationships. Friends will, of course, on occasion be means to an end. But the more we make friends into means, even if they're not merely means, the more we take the pulp out of our friendships. To treat friends as means is to violate the very nature of friendship. Still, this is not to say that friends are ends in themselves. That would be to confuse citizens with friends. We take pleasure in the singularity of our friends. They are for us irreplaceable, unsubstitutable. The disagreement required in treating others as ends in themselves, the disengagement required in treating others as ends in themselves, this is not possible in friendship. Simone Weil writes of intimate friendship, and she puts it beautifully, really, that it is the miracle by which a person consents to view from a certain distance and without coming any nearer the very being who is necessary to him as food. Unquote. Two other observations follow from this. First, the categorical imperative begins with the individual, whereas the politics of pure means begins with the neighbor. The categorical imperative seeks to establish the principles by which to rationally treat others as ends in themselves, and it begins with the individualized monad as the quintessential end. This end may expand to include whole social groups, but their nature as individualized monads does not change. By contrast, the politics of pure means begins with a recognition of its finitude, of its being held in a world that surrounds it, that it did not create and that will outlast it. This acknowledgement of being thrown into a world requires neighborliness as a response, requires treating the world not as an object to be mastered, save for those who, like oneself, are ends in themselves, but rather as companions to whom friendship is always already owed. Second, the categorical imperative is universalist, whereas the politics of pure means is neighborly. Put differently, while the categorical imperative must treat all rational beings or all animate life as equal, and moreover come up with some abstract or universal criteria by which this infinitude can be translated into equality, the politics of pure means is neighborly. It pleads inability to promulgate or enact any universal equality. To do so, it thinks, would be conceit on its part. It insists instead on practicing equality with its neighbors, especially the most marginal amongst its neighbors. It tries, moreover, to practice this equality in a way that is not antagonistic to those who are not yet neighbors. That will-centered politics, even in its most democratic form of the categorical imperative, and the politics that relinquishes the will, that these two are antithetical to each other, this is undeniable. But how to describe this relationship? Here, the answer turns out to be tautological. Relinquishment is itself the relationship. We can take our hint from the fact that Gandhi both led the struggle for parliamentary swaraj and insisted that parliamentary swaraj was not the swaraj he sought. As this suggests, he was not rejecting parliamentary swaraj. He could not. It was not only that he was too acutely aware that most Indians around him desired it, and arguably that he desired it himself. It is also that to simply reject the desire for parliamentary swaraj would have been to exercise a willed relationship to it. The point really is to not desire it. So rather than convert that desire for republican democracy into a will, he sought to cultivate a discipline that would enable them to enable satyagrahis to relinquish that desire itself and center itself towards a democratic politics centered on non-willing. Only such a relinquishment would be in keeping with the logic of non-willing. For to will relinquishment would be to violate the very character of relinquishment. One of the names that Gandhi gave to this social discipline of relinquishment was Swadeshi, insisting that Swadeshi had nothing to do with the nationalism involved in the will of the people, with nationalism as the consumption of the products of wholly domestic industry. But Swadeshi was only one of its names. Satyagraha, friendship, ahimsa, daya, prem, these are all part of his quiver of antonyms, each with a slightly different focus, but each trying to focus on the politics of pure means of surrender without subordination. Thank you. I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you. Fantastic. Now, I have two questions. One is a sort of pernickety linguistic question. Can you tell us a bit more about the language in Gandhi's texts that really drew you into thinking about Gandhi's thinking about willing and non-willing types of freedom, right? And in the language that you came across, what were the stickiest words? What were the words most difficult to translate? What were the fugitive words that you were on? So that's one. And the other one is this. Now, of course, Western political theory has for some time been very focused on the will as the source of action, right? And that's why it's such an important idea in the center of thinking about how politics is done in whatever regime, whether democratic or otherwise. Now, whether you assert the will or whether you relinquish it, this is still a will focused way of thinking about political life. Now, of course, we know that in Indian political theory, of various sorts, in various ages, a concept of action that has been very central, very important, and quite widespread is one of duty, let's say, right? So the idea, the logic of action is not one where where the desire, the will, the wish to do something is what drives action, but rather doing what's right? So it's is at the basis of action. So that's a very different way of conceiving action of any sort, and certainly of political action.
Yes.
And it would so that's not a matter of rejecting the will, relinquishing the will. The will simply plays no part in it at all. What matters is that you do what's right rather than you do what's wrong. So what role does that, if any, play in Gandhi's thinking.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
So, yes.
Great. Okay, let me just, the language of, as I was saying at the beginning, I had absolutely no plan of spending this long on Gandhi, and it started actually with an undergraduate class, for which since
People do get hung up on him, don't they?
And it actually, I just happened to have bought on my trip to India before that, a cheap Gujarati version of Swaraj. I was not even interested in Gandhi particularly, but why not have a version? That's why I had it, right? And when teaching it in an undergrad class, I happened to look up some Gujarati words, and the translation that actually puzzled me first was, the first thing that struck me was that the word history occurred in the English version, and he tried to distinguish between history and itihas. And that's a distinction that's completely lacking in the English version. And which made me feel that, look, there's something more going on here that I don't think he knows what's going on, really. It's not as though he's saying one thing in Gujarati and another in English. It's more that, as with any new thought, right? People who are thinkers of the new often are not necessarily in control of their thinking, right? And I think that was what triggered it. It led on to a lot of other words, and I think that would be more or less the trajectory of my book. So I'll avoid going into that and trajectory of all what I've written. So that's, but so really it's the language in Gandhi's text, the way that he uses these words in ways that he often does not seem entirely in control of, and that are open up avenues that are very, very fascinating. The will as a source of action, yes, I could not agree more with you about the contrast between duty and the will. But I think what is interesting about Gandhi, and this is why, the figure of the neighbor is so interesting, that there is a tradition of duty, or there is, if duty is the word you want, the word that Gandhi often prefers is dharma, which is also actually what he often translates into English as duty, right? Again, I think the idea of dharma is very interesting, because dharma is obviously, as I was saying, an action that is not willed. But what has changed in the time that when Gandhi comes to this word, and when others come to this word in a modern time, is that there has been a will-centered critique of duty, so to speak. That in some ways, the violence of the language of duty is perhaps clearer than it would have been earlier, right? And it's in the context of this violence, right, that people like Gandhi must return to this term. And simply the fact that they must return to this term in this context means that they must rework the term, right? Think, for example, of Gandhi's uptake of the phrase "love thy neighbor as thyself," right? Now, what's fascinating is that this is a phrase that he encounters very likely in South Africa in his conversations with missionaries. There is, strictly speaking, no analogy to it that he dwells on in the Hindu text that he's familiar with. So when he takes up that injunction, but he nevertheless finds a parallel to it effectively in the Gita. Now, when he takes up the injunction, he cannot take it up in the same way as, say, even Kierkegaard would have, writing slightly, just a few decades earlier, but things have already begun changing, right? He takes it up at a moment when the figure of the neighbor, is in a way falling into obscurity. And one symptom of the obscurity of the figure of the neighbor in our modern times is, the way that Freud responds to this figure in Civilization and its discontents, right? increasingly from what I'm saying is that within the language of the categorical imperative and its universalism, the figure of the neighbor becomes invisible, right? Because, neighborly relations, let's face it, have nothing to do with equality, not necessarily, right? Even if you say love thy neighbor, it does not mean love thy neighbor in some equal way, right? It can mean love thy neighbor in a profoundly unequal way, right? So the challenge of loving,
as you love thyself. So there is a
that's a fascinating, that's the one
classical formulation.
Absolutely. That's the one that Kierkegaard picks up on also, to say that what really matters is as thyself, right? Not just love thy neighbor, but love thy neighbor as thyself, right? No, you're absolutely right there. But so as Kierkegaard says, the question is, how do you love yourself? That's the first question you must ask. So when Gandhi takes up this question, he must take it up at a moment where another way of loving oneself has emerged. The love involved in the categorical imperative. I mean, I'm using the categorical imperative merely as a stand-in for everything, not because Gandhi knew it or anything, but because for me, it is the most powerful formulation, the most powerful and persuasive formulation of the politics of the will. Even though, of course, we'd qualify it today in ways that, Kant himself would not have, but I still think that it provides the most powerful protocol for that. Right? So once you have this way of loving yourself involved in the categorical imperative, right? The question of what does it mean to love oneself in an equal way, and in a context where nationalism has also come about, where most of all the concept of the people has emerged, right? That changes things, right? Because it's no longer love thy neighbor as thyself. It's also love thy neighbor as thyself in the context of Swadeshi, in the context of Swaraj, right? So there is this new entity that has come into being also, right? Which changes the implications of the figure of the neighbor. Right? So that's part of what I think, those are some of the ways in which I think, even as he returns to these words like duty, he often inadvertently ends up imbuing them with a new connotation. Sorry for such a long answer,
Yes, well, now let's open to discussion. I'm sure there are lots of questions. We don't see any hands yet, but perhaps there are so few of us in a sense that we can just open. Did it?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ajay. I mean, as usual, it was a very textured and dense presentation which needed to be read rather than listened to. So I'm not sure whether I have actually followed the schemes of the argument completely. But I'd like to ask, one short question and one long question. The short question relates to something that you brought up in response to, Anastasia, the question of history, and which I think connects up also with the broader argument that you've been making, that when he discusses the idea of history, for him, and in fact, he appears to be quite similar to Brudel in his understanding of what should be the province of history, that history tends to describe the events that happen around one, right? And actually, history is something else. So, for example, in Hind Swaraj, he gives the instance of brothers who have a conflict with each other and resolve it through the act of love, through the act of self-abnegation, instead of going to the court, lawyers, and so on. Had it gone to the court, lawyers, and so on, you would have had a record of it, it would have become history. Right? So that kind of idea of history as that which is that the real history is that which belongs to another time. Right? And you brought up the question of time in relation to the time of philosophy, the time of religion. And here there's another time that we're talking about, which kind of meshes with the time of religion. Something that cannot be spoken of. Right?
Yes.
Because really we cannot know history. Because if it's like a tree falling in the forest and nobody's there to observe it, or as in Ramakrishna Paramahamsa's wonderful example where he's asked by his disciples, what is the nature of religious experience? And then Ramakrishna Paramahamsa tells them about three men who go into the forest and come across a high wall. And the first man climbs up on top and says, magnificent, and jumps over. The second one climbs on top and says, wonderful, and jumps over, and so on. And at the end, there's no one left to tell us what the nature of religious experience is. So I think there's something there of the ineffable about history. And this is something that I've always struggled with. I mean, as to where does this lead one to, right? And so that's in the nature of the short question, even though it was rather long. The long question is really about, it's a historical question, because we tend to see Gandhi, this is something we've talked about, we tend to see Gandhi as a 20th century figure, but actually he's very much a 19th century figure. He was born in 1869, right? And his intellectual formation happens in the 19th century. And a lot of it is also determined by his time in England, where 1867 is a Reform Act, right? And you have the first opening up of the idea of politics as being the domain of the people, of the kinds of issues that you've talked about, that you speak in the name of the people. There's a parliamentary, and Hind Swaraj reflects a lot of these debates. His kind of fraught relation with the idea of parliament, his fraught relation with the idea of who can exercise will, right? I mean, when you talk about the satyagrahi, being a satyagrahi is not open to everyone. It's not a democratic principle. Right? Not everyone can become a satyagrahi. So starting from what I feel autobiographically, and this may be a very ad hominem argument, starting from a sense of unease about the entry of the masses, so to speak, into politics, and the idea of parliament being a way of modulating this entry and his sense of unease with it, the question then becomes, who can exercise a relinquishing of the will, right? Not everyone can, only a satyagrahi can. Who can have a conscience? And a lot of these ideas which I think stems from a deep conservatism, right? And you have actually spoken about that in your book, right?
Yes.
And and that deep conservatism is also a kind of desire not to relinquish unto the people the principle of action that is not willed action. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
So in that sense, this is a very exemplary elitist politics, to put it very crudely. It's just a formulation that I'm putting before you. An exemplary elitist politics that is deeply suspicious. And here I don't want to go into the bourgeois mascot kind of argument, right? I mean, that's the other extreme of such a formulation, but to stay at this end. So the question of freedom is constantly deferred in Gandhi, except for himself.
I wouldn't say except for himself, yeah, but broadly, yeah.
So, I mean, so these two questions about history and who can be in history, what can be history, whose actions are historical, as well as this question of the deferral of freedom relate to this question of conservatism. And I just wondered whether you can reflect a bit on on those two issues. And therefore, to this distinction that you make about the relinquishing of the will and the exercise of the will, this conservatism kind of muddies that distinction quite a bit for me.
Yes.
So anyway, I mean, I'm not sure this is a very clearly framed question, but as I said, I really need to read what you spoke about.
No, I think it's a beautifully framed question, and I really appreciate it very much. And the first question, the question of history, I mean, just to be clear, and I think you and I would agree on this, is that he's not quite a Brodelian either, right? In that sense, right? Because Brodel is still talking of the deeper structures of history, right? That is to say, he's talking of that which is not immediately visible, but can be made visible. Whereas what Gandhi is trying to emphasize, to my mind, is the sense in which, I mean, the word you used here is perfect, ineffable, right? That, that which is ineffable, right? I mean, and I think, again, phenomena like friendship are exemplary of this, right? What does it mean to say that you're my friend? I cannot ever prove that you're my friend or I'm your friend, right? It is something ineffable, right? And this ineffability is absolutely crucial to the entire politics that Gandhi is stressing, right? And this ineffability is also precisely its danger, right? Because as you can imagine, there is, and this is one of the reasons that Arendt is so critical of civil disobedience, right? Because as she says rightly, right, that, I mean, if my conscience is to decide the way you act, then it can get quite troubling, right? If the conscience of a crank is to decide the way the world acts, that can be that is not, which is why I would like to stress, and I think this is very, very important, which is why I was trying to bring out what I think is aspirationally, and I really stress that this is thinking with Gandhi, right? I'm not trying to say that this is what Gandhi said, right? Because as we both know, right, I mean, Gandhi's writings are very complex, and to say that Gandhi said something would be very would take too much, and there is much that one would be very, very skeptical of, right? And I'm not really engaged in the historical exercise of trying to say what Gandhi said. So I think aspirationally, what is interesting about what Gandhi does is that there's this relationship where the politics of the will is not rejected, right? That's why I think the distinction between rejection and relinquishment is very, very crucial, right? Because to reject would be to master something. To reject would be exactly the moment that Arendt refers to, where I, as a crank, insist on you going by what, and we know that Gandhi did this often enough, right? So it's not as though it's a false possibility; it's a non-existent possibility. Yeah. So that's the first question. I know this is just getting at some of what, but hopefully the second one will get back to this. Yes, I could not agree more with you that Gandhi is conservative, right? I think this word conservative is absolutely crucial. I think it's also important to remember where conservatism arises, right? Also, I think, first of all, just to avoid confusion, we should distinguish, as you know, between conservatism and neoconservatism, right? And conservatism is a genuinely interesting tradition. Neoconservatism is a right-wing, project. It's very symptomatic, for example, that Michael Oakeshott has this intriguing essay. As you know, Oakeshott is himself in some ways right-wing, but not right-wing in the Thatcherite sense. But Oakeshott has this interesting essay called "On Being Conservative." He sends it. I forget where he sends it. I'm now blanking who he sent it to, but one of these major American conservatives of the time, maybe Irving Kristol, maybe I'm misremembering the name. He sends it to their journal to be published. The one who was Gertrude Himmelfarb's husband, right? That guy. So I mean, it'll come back to me. But so he rejects it. The editor rejects it because he tells Oakeshott, this is not the kind of conservatism I'm interested in, right? And this is in the 60s or something, maybe slightly earlier, when the distinction between conservatism and neoconservatism is beginning to open up. The reason I'm stressing this is because I think what is intriguing about conservatism is that it is an attempt which can be formulated only after the thematization of a politics of the will, which is really a modern phenomenon. It is an attempt to think of a politics outside the will, at least in the Burkean formulation, etc. Right? As we know all too well, right? It often becomes profoundly authoritarian, right? So that is why I think it's very important. If one is, I would both stress that Gandhi's stressing conservatism, but that what destabilizes Gandhi's conservatism is this, unlike the Burkean tradition, Gandhi is, at least to the extent the satyagraha has to be practiced by claiming authority through surrender, he is introducing a dimension of equality into conservatism, right? Which is why sometimes I've called it a radical conservatism, because the moment you introduce equality into conservatism, right, there is a certain instability that arises in this conservatism, right? But to think in terms of the neighbor is already, in a sense, to be conservative, right? If you think of it, that is to say that when I say I care for my neighbor, whether it's a geographical neighbor or a topological neighbor, I'm emphasizing the relationships that I'm thrown into. To be conservative in that sense is to acknowledge that the world is something that I inherit, right? And I act in something that is an inheritance, right? So it's that other sense of conservatism, which I think is implicit in what Burke is saying, which is part of what Uday has been emphasizing. Some of the more thoughtful people writing on conservatism have been emphasizing, right? That I would like to stress as the crux of not conservatism as distinct from neoconservatism, right? And I think in this tradition, Gandhi is a particularly fascinating figure because he introduces the dimension of equality, which transforms what conservatism is about. So that's what I would stress as the crux of the response that I would make to this. You
know. Thank you.
Incidentally, since you said Gertrude Himmelfarb's husband, it's Irving Kristol. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I was blanking the name. I don't know why.
Well, are there any more questions? I don't see any hands. I mean, for those who are still here, I think the Friday of the first sort of seminar Friday of the beginning of the year is a tasking sort of time. So I think we are coming to
Anastasia, can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Yes. Can you reveal yourself? Can we see you? Turn on the camera.
I'm not in a situation where I can sort of.
That's fine. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for opening a completely new area for me. So for all this, I'm not even a philosopher, but I haven't actually thought about this. So it's a new thing for me. But please, Ajay, could you sort of, in today's context, tell us why Gandhi matters? Because I think that bit, in a more practical way, if you could explain.
Sure. No, the reason that I think Gandhi matters today is because I think, first of all, I think in two ways. That is to say, the question of how to engage in a politics that is both, that does not reject a will-centered politics, right? That is to say that we cannot ever stop demanding, economic, social justice in terms of the language of rights. Because I think that should be self-evident. But at the same time, to stress that we must do so profoundly skeptically and with an attempt to nourish simultaneously other modalities of existing in the world, right? Modalities of political friendship. Right. And that is why I suppose, one word that we often use that is overused, but I think actually means a lot, is nonviolence, right? Which I would translate as a politics of relating to others to the extent that one can, because again, there's a matter of relinquishment, not of rejection, through a vulnerability, by stressing by creating a society not based on rights, but on a certain vulnerability, which is not the same as duty, right? And I think that is the crux of, to go back to the question that Dilip was raising, and Anastasia was also raising, perhaps the crux of the difference between conservatism and Gandhi's own approach is that where conservatism emphasizes limits in a substantive sense, in the sense of duty, right? The Gandhian approach emphasizes limits more in the sense of the vulnerability involved in being open to the other, right? So I know that again, this remains very abstract, but I mean, I suppose I see it embodied quite honestly in a lot of anarchist, non-violent movements that are taking place, and I use anarchist for want of a better word, but
be reasonable. Sorry.
So no, sorry, did you have a further?
Yes. Would it be reasonable to ask you, how would you translate that if you had a child? You were sort of guiding a child in thinking in that Gandhian way. How would you proceed?
Well, my daughter is a full-time activist for Sunrise, which is an environmental justice movement here. And I wouldn't want to claim too much responsibility for myself for all that has happened, because I don't think parents have too much to do with the way children turn out, But I would like to think that maybe, I mean, I do admire her work very much because, I suppose, and what I would say is basically think of how to bring about political change non-violently in a way that respects the other, while recognizing at the same time that even non-violence is a relationship of relinquishment, right? Because the moment you participate in a state, you are engaged in some kind of violence, right? So it's not as though you're ever in a world outside violence, right? So yeah. So I suppose I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, that's actually wonderful. Thank you.
So, Uday?
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Ajay. It was wonderful to listen to you after a long time. It was great.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions which are really seeking some clarification, and I'm sure that these ideas are very central to your thinking. I was struck by that observation which you made comparing the Gujarati and the English about the word neighbor. In the Gujarati and also in the Hindi translation, what you have is not a singular individuated figure like a neighbor. What you have is people who live in the neighborhood, people who live around you. That's the kind. And that is really justified because we are made in such a way that we cannot really reach out to something. So this idea of neighborhood as a kind of space, a finite space where human action can reach out to but not go beyond, is seen as intrinsic to the way we are made as creatures of some kind.
Absolutely.
And so and then he contrasts with the idea of conceit. It's conceit that makes you think that you can universalize. So is there a relationship between will, in the sense in which you used it, and this tendency to conceit? Because we have to admit that conceit is also part of the kind of creatures that we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So is there something of that kind within this opposition of will and the relinquishing of will? Are we really getting in contact with two different aspects of Gandhi's conception of the human creature? And
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And so does that change the idea of the political subject, the question of sovereignty? Because I was, sometimes I wondered when listening to you, where the categories of Western political theory, in terms of which you were trying to explicate Gandhi's ideas here, where there was a kind of interesting gap there. There was some translation project, which is happening there, and which itself is what needs to be thematized in some sense, isn't it? Like, for example,
could you say more about that last remark? I don't quite follow you.
Yeah, like for example, the question of theology and mysticism. And if we take this idea of the subject, which is actually, like contradictory or divided between, on the one hand, conceit, and on the other hand, some kind of finitude beyond which it cannot reach, then probably the idea of religion which comes up there, or the idea of religiosity which comes up there, or in Gandhi's word, the relationship between the creature and its maker which comes up there. I do not know if that attitude can be classified in terms of understood in terms of a theology or negative theology or mysticism. I wondered if we need a different vocabulary for it. I just wondered. So
yes. No, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Because I feel that entire set of terms which we use, faith, belief, etc., there is a kind of conception of the human subject. Probably it is a little different. I'm not saying that it is completely devoid of resonances of that conception of the human subject when it comes to Gandhi, but I feel that there is the foregrounding of something else, something which is not fully captured within that in Gandhi. So, I know this is a vague, question, but I just thought I would put it on the table for you to, respond to.
No. I mean, I think you're absolutely on to. I mean, your point about faith, I could not agree with more. Right? That there is a sense in which. I think this perhaps did not emerge clearly enough, and actually does not emerge now that you mention it, does not emerge clearly enough in what I've written so far. That faith is also a reconstitution of, at least in the way that it works in Gandhi, is also potentially a reconstitution of the human subject itself, right? Because precisely in the vulnerability of faith, right, the human subject cannot remain in the same way. So you're right there that, I think it pushes some of these categories to the limit. But I also think that you cannot think of Gandhi without these Western categories.
Sure.
Because he's engaged with them, right? This is what, in a sense, part of his creativity, to the extent that he's creative, is precisely because he's engaged in a conversation, that basically takes these Western categories of liberty and finds them inadequate, and tries to return to the classical conservatism. And in the process of attempting perhaps even a conscious return to that classical conservatism, he gets derailed in ways that he does not quite know, right? And that's what I stress, that there's this kind of way in which he's doing something more than he thinks he's doing,
right?
And different from what he thinks he's doing. And part of what is happening here is also this kind of faith that is without a subject. No, I would. I think that's a wonderful point, and I think I would like to incorporate that a bit more into what I.
And if I may just add a very small, point to that about the question of neighborhood. It also intrigued me why this idea of a finitude of our reach is important for Gandhi.
Right. Yeah. So sorry, that was the first question, which I did not get to actually. The finitude of our reach. I mean, to come back to the first question. Is for Gandhi, and I think for the conservative tradition, to the extent that there is a conservative tradition as distinct from the neoconservative tradition, is the crux of conservatism, right? That we are finite beings, right? And that therefore to exercise the will is already to make ourselves infinite. Part of, I think, the distinctiveness of modernity is precisely that neighborhoods become less visible, precisely because we are in a society of will, right? The moment we are in a society that's centered around the will, neighbors become relatively invisible. And I mean, one of the things that in the essay that has been present called "Who is Gandhi's Neighbor?" Right? One of the things that I stress is exactly the point that you made, right? That it is not neighbor but neighbors, right? Because it is the very nature, and that's the difference between, say, the other and the neighbor.
Exactly.
Other is the other. To talk of the neighbor is to recognize that there are others. And that's a very, very important distinction, right? That, because the moment I'm thinking in terms of the other, I've started theologizing. Because then I have this other to whom even if I owe an infinite responsibility to the other, the singularity of the unicity of the other is itself a theological movement.
Right.
And so that's what I would stress. And I think that's something that I'd really like to emphasize.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add another very small question to that. That is about this finitude of the reach. You know, a kind of immediate reading which occurs to us is that since we are creatures with limited capacities, we cannot really serve people who are far distant from us. So we can only serve people who are immediately around us. You know, that is one way of. But it is also possible that we are finite in that we are powerfully affected by people who are immediately around us. Yeah.
Yes.
So in that sense, this neighborhood may also be not a function of finitude in a negative sense, but finitude in a positive sense, in the sense that it is also a domain of greater intensity. You know, intensity.
Absolutely, absolutely. I did not mean finitude in a negative sense at all.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I just wonder. No, I you did not say that. I was just wondering how we understand that, you know, idea of.
It is only in it is finitude becomes a negative thing only once you adopt the problematic of the will.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that within that problematic, of course, finitude will be negative, right?
Yeah.
So what a part of what I think is happening with Gandhi is that he's returning, and not only Gandhi, I mean, we can think of a whole philosophical tradition, right? You know, which then thematizes finitude in a way that could not have been thematized before modernity.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So that's what is important. That it's not that the neighbor, I mean, after all, the neighbor is love thy neighbor as thyself goes back 2000 years. Right.
Yes.
So, but to return to the neighbor in the context of nationalism, in that modern context of the equality of a people. Right.
Yes.
That is very different from love thy neighbor when there is no people.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
You know,
I understand. So, thank you.
So no, those are great. Thanks so much. Huh? Yeah. Dilip and Pierce, I think.
Yeah. Dilip first.
Go ahead, Piers. I've already asked a question, so.
Okay. About neighbors and love, of course, I'm thinking of some of my own neighbors in the course of my lifetime, whom I actually hated. And of course, we know in Indian villages, like everywhere else, people are often killing their neighbors. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that's
into the context of what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's what
the idea of a parosi or a paros is very different from the neighbor in the Christian sense. So do you think of?
Yes, and I think that's those who reside near me is very crucial. And I think that's the general sense of the neighbor, you know, which is there in the etymology of the word neighbor itself, which too is about those who are near one, right? So in that sense, at least what Gandhi is saying in Gujarati is actually close to the etymological sense of the word neighbor, in the English word neighbor. And I could not agree more about the violence of neighborliness, right? In everyday life, right? And in a sense, Gandhi himself stresses that in the Hind Swaraj, for example, when he says that, look, you know, when two people stay together, heads will get broken. That's life, right? So in a sense, this is the sense in which I was saying also earlier that it's not as though a politics of neighborliness is non-violent, right? It is rather a different kind of violence. It's a violence that is, and I use this word very cautiously here, because when I say finite, I don't mean finite in the sense of either finite in its implications for those at the receiving end or anything like that, but finite in terms of its ability to, shall we say, travel. So I would stress that the neighbor, and that's why again, you know, and what you said, Pierce, is exactly what Freud says in you know, that, you know, I mean, perhaps it's the neighbor whom I should, I mean, you know, Freud cites Schiller, you know, saying that, look, I'm willing to forgive my neighbors after I've seen them strung up and hung, right? So, which is a very nice.
I suppose it's about being enmeshed, isn't it? And therefore the ambivalence of feelings about enmeshment. Because the same people who are doing sorcery against each other are also the same people, perhaps, who are brothers or who should be cooperating but aren't.
Exactly. And I think it's that bounded relationship, that finite relationship, that Gandhi is suggesting that we start from. And I think his argument really, and I think perhaps the way in which the neighbor matters most of all to Gandhi, is that a politics of non-violence can only begin from the neighbor, right? Because if I begin with a citizen, then I have already exercised the will, right? So the neighbor, perhaps what is important about the neighbor is not that the neighbor is non-violent in any way, but that a politics of non-violence, a politics of vulnerability involves the comportment of neighborliness. So yeah, so I think that's why I don't think one should avoid, and the Gandhi does not avoid the tendency at all, but one should avoid, to the extent that we're thinking with Gandhi and not trying to simply repeat what Gandhi is saying, right? One should avoid the temptation to romanticize the neighbor. I think there is no, I don't think we can romanticize the neighbor at all. Yeah, I think that would be ridiculous given all that we've seen across the world, so.
Thank you.
Actually, I think this discussion that, Uday, Pierce, this question of neighborliness brought back the third category that you started with, but we didn't really elaborate, of liberty, equality, fraternity, because the question of the neighbor also brings in the question of fraternity.
Absolutely.
And may I suggest, and this is a way of kind of trying to put the problem sharply, when you ask who is Gandhi's neighbor, I would say from what I've read of Gandhi, that Gandhi can only imagine himself as his neighbor, right? It's a kind of, it's not about non-violence, it's about exclusion. It's about the creation of an abstraction called the ashram, where to go back to my first question, is conservatism and the specter that is haunting the world, that of the masses, as opposed to the idea of the people. Democracy tries to tame the idea of the masses by introducing the idea of the people in whose name states and governments speak. Gandhi remains throughout his life fearful of wanting to separate himself from the masses. Hence his retreat into spaces like the ashram, where the idea of the neighborliness actually undercuts the idea of fraternity because it works with the politics of exemplarity, i.e. only Gandhi can be his neighbor, right? The ideal neighbor, nobody else can. So I think that's the way in which I would like to pose the question, because otherwise, to go back to what you were saying about the idea of the world as inheritance, right? That's a phrase that you used, that asparos is very different from the idea of the neighbor. Asparos is something willy-nilly. There are people around you. What can you do about it, right? And what Gandhi does about it is to create the ashram, to circumscribe and separate, right? And this is a function of his conservatism. It's also the function of the limits of his politics, right? And that's where we bring in Ambedkar, and like Aishwari brings in Ambedkar and so on. So I think and which has been the problem with my, with your rendition of the idea of the ashram, is your early essay, right? Yes, and you elaborate upon that in the book. I don't find the idea of the ashram in Gandhi as being a hospitable one. It's an exclusionary idea. And for all these various scattered thoughts that I put before you. So so to bring back this question of fraternity, I do not know if a Gandhian politics allows for fraternity, which goes back to Sunu's question. How is Gandhi relevant for our times? How would you explain this to a child? And so on and so forth. So right. I'm just putting the question very sharply here.
Sure. No, I think, what I would say is, and in a way, I think the third term did come back. It came back as friendship rather than fraternity, right? And I think that is a very, important move, right? Because fraternity, I think, has, Dilip, yes.
Can I say something? One chooses one's.
Dilip, I've lost you. Dilip, are you there?
He's got frozen.
Okay, so it's not only me who's not hearing him.
No, he's frozen.
Okay.
What a shame.
Dilip, are you with us?
I don't know.
No, he has. He's got the stuff.
I was just going to say one thing, if I may. I was curious about what the English word neighbor is a translation of. So I've just looked in the New Testament in Greek. And what Jesus is saying is, love the person who is plesion to you, which is a very spatial word.
Love the person who
suggests the person who is spatially near to you is what the Greek word means, which makes this person inescapable, of course.
Yes, yes.
But it's not a word of relationality at all. It's a word of inescapable spatiality.
Yes, and which is very similar to Aspasvastava Manaso, that is to say, again, an inescapable spatiality, right? And therefore, an inescapable relationality also, I would add, right? Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that inescapable relationality is what I would stress about the neighbor as a figure that Gandhi is taking up. And that to my mind, that to my mind is very similar, right? But he's taking it up in a modern context, very similar to the figure of the neighbor, at least as Kierkegaard traces the figure, in the Bible. So. Dilip, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. Yes, I kind of somehow it blipped off, and I stopped being your neighbor on the panel. But here I am. But I'm not sure how you responded to that question about the, to put it extremely, the impossibility of fraternity and the ashram being a device.
Yes, right? Yes. No, I did not respond because we stopped when, so I can respond now, right? And I would stress that the word friend is absolutely crucial, partially because in a way, even as Gandhi uses friend and brother, interchangeably, I do think that there is a relation, there is a difference. And I'd also agree with you. Actually, let me go step by step. I should start first by saying that the ashram is exemplary of the non-democratic conservatism that Gandhi practices. That is to say, the ashram is a profoundly hierarchical space. It is, you just have to look at the correspondence within the ashram to realize that Gandhi is very much of a father figure there. So, in a way, I think that the ashram dissolves may also not be entirely accidental. That Gandhi himself does not return to the ashram after a certain point. The other thing I would stress is that where the ashram is centered around the father and the brother, the politics that Gandhi ends up willy-nilly practicing is more centered around the figure of a democratic neighborliness or political friendship. And again, I think the reason I use democratic neighborliness or political friendship is because I want to stress the dimension of equality, right? That I think is a potential and often activated potential and often inactivated, unactivated too, but I'm more interested for now in the aspirational dimension, is a potential of Gandhi's politics. And this equality centered around vulnerability is perhaps one way of putting it, So, yeah, so, I would say that fraternity is recuperated by both Gandhi and I would say Ambedkar, right, as friendship, right? Because Ambedkar invokes liberty, equality, fraternity, and then goes on to displace it with friendship. Right? So I think that is not
constantly emphasizes that Gandhi can never be a true friend.
Yes.
Right? When he talks about the idea of the Kaivari, right?
Yes. Yeah. No.
There's also an interesting tension.
There is a fundamental incommensurability between the two. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Though again, I would like to. I think of them as. And this is again another essay that I'm in the midst of writing. I hope I finish it soon. I would think of them as in a parallax relationship, right? And that is one of the things that I really want to dwell on. So I don't think of them as being in an antagonistic relationship as much as this parallax relationship that,
Explain, it's not clear to me. Parallax is about the distortion induced by a medium, right?
Yes. What I would say is, and this is really an argument that I'm still working through, so I feel that, I may put this less well than I would like to, but very simply put, I would say that what they share is, that this parallax is animated by two different ways of enacting equality, ways that must both be affirmed and yet cannot be reconciled, ways that are sometimes complementary, sometimes agonistic, sometimes antagonistic. And the reason I'm saying parallax is, perhaps one way of putting it is that Ambedkar begins from political democracy, in the sense of the institutions of political democracy, and moves to something closer to friendship, political friendship. Gandhi begins from political friendship, but yet cannot give up on political democracy, right? And another way of putting it, and honestly, I'm just putting this in ways that I may not be able to necessarily defend at this point, because I'm just beginning to write this, that where Gandhi is focused more on the figure of the neighbor, and therefore on a certain sociality. Ambedkar is concerned more with the equality of the social, right? That is to say, an equality that works out the principles that generate society and its division, that in some senses emphasizes a politics of egalitarianism much more, right? So these two equalities, to my mind, are in a kind of tense relationship with each other. And part of that, what I want to do is tease out this relationship a bit more, which will be, in a way, another way of returning to some of the themes in this paper that I've just presented, So, yeah, but I know that's a very inadequate answer. But
anyway, it does turn out that Ambedkar and Gandhi are terribly friends in the end, which is might as well. Well, do I see any more hands? There's something in the chat, but not in the.
As
okay.
Jiski Lathi Uski Bhes.
That's right. Yes.
So, what did you say?
Quoting from what someone's written, Vijay has written, Jiski Lathi Uski Bhes.
Versus Gandhi. Yes. Well, something to think on. Thank you so much, Ajay. And thank you for getting up at 8 a.m. Hey. I was doing this seminar at his 8 a.m. So this is a great feat of neighborliness. So we'll see you next time at the next seminar, yes, which is 2 weeks. And there'll be news on who it is, and there'll be news on our launch conference, which will be happening at the end of June in Cambridge, and details forthcoming very shortly. Thank you again.